Hector continued to shamble through the obliterated streets of Kudin. Repeatedly, he was struck by the notion that he should have been a blithering mess in a corner somewhere. Yet he continued to feel almost nothing. There was no time to ponder the nature of this lack of response, though. He had decided upon a course of action, and there was a task at hand. Hector continued his search for other survivors. At first, he had hoped that he may have come across Chris, Helena, or even Eris. Now he wasn't sure who or what he was looking for. He had no real destination in mind. Not that there was much to survey. Wherever Hector looked, it was an identical scene, a sea of innumerable pieces of rubble. Cement, bricks, mortar, plaster, and glass littered the ground in colossal piles of debris. Hector had to frequently turn around and change his route because he came across a road that was so heavily obstructed he couldn't pass. A heavy blanket of smog and dust hung over every street Hector turned down, the end result of the fires raging all across Kudin. Hector's mouth and nose were raw and aching from inhaling a part of the cloud with every breath. It was like breathing in a million tiny shards of glass every time his lungs expanded, which, he realized, may very well have been the case. He did his best to keep his mouth covered, pulling his hood over his head and the neck of the jumper up over his mouth and nose. It wasn't perfect, but he didn't have a mask. Any sliver of exposed skin itched and prickled as well, but there didn't seem to be anything that Hector could do about that. When a city was burning, that heat naturally hung in the air and bit at anyone caught within it. Hector had seen a fair amount of disaster and war movies in his 14 years. They were some of his favorites. Now that he was living it, though, he was realizing that the screen would never be able to truly capture the horrors before him. The physical destruction alone was somehow both grander in scale than almost anything he had seen in a film, but also much more intimate, since it was a place he knew and loved. Then there were the senses that a movie just couldn't capture. Sure, a production team could create a reasonably accurate approximation of what a disaster looked like and sounded like, but they could never convey the reality of it. They couldn't capture how it tasted or smelled. It was a lot to experience, and none of it pleasant. Yet it felt almost surreal to Hector. He was experiencing it, suffering through it, but it was almost as if he was detached from it all. It was just too much for one person to take in. At times, he would come across a person's remains just lying in the middle of the street or under a pile of rubble. Frequently, these remains were not whole, and it was only pieces of the deceased that he stumbled upon. A bisected body or the limb of someone who was blown apart by the blast or torn asunder by the destruction of their home or workplace. Strangely, Hector often traveled down patches of road that were splattered with blood, but with no bodies, alive or otherwise, in sight. He wondered if this was a sign that survivors had moved on from the scene. Something in the back of Hector's mind told him that he should investigate these absences further. Perhaps he could find a place survivors had gathered. He ignored this instinct. It was rare to come across others. Those that he had found had been in much the same circumstances as the baby he had first encountered. Either they were completely buried under the remains of some building and he couldn't even see them, or they were partially stuck with part of their bodies crushed under debris. Following blood smears would only lead to more of the same. At this point, Hector did not even stop for those he found trapped. There was no malice in the choice. He didn't want those people to die. However, he had learned quickly that it was impossible for him to do anything to help them. A few times now, he had tried to free those who were only partially buried. However, he lacked the strength, equipment, and expertise to pull any of them to freedom. A haphazard rescue attempt was just as likely to make matters worse and maybe even trap himself with them. He decided that he could give them hope, though, at the least. So he told them he was going to find help and send them their way. Then he would leave them too. Each of those meetings brought with them a soundtrack of agonized screaming, disoriented groans, and desperate begging. Always those sounds were accompanied by the scent of smoke and dust, sometimes of burning flesh. Those experiences would cling to Hector as he left people to their fates. He pushed them to the back of his mind and tuned them out. Anyone trapped was dead before they finished breathing. He had to keep looking for people that had a chance. That is what kept him walking, though he left a trail of the damned behind him. Eventually, Hector found himself in a neighborhood that had fared a little better than the previous few. It was true that the majority of the buildings here were still obliterated and that the ones that had managed to remain standing were little more than ruins. However, this was the first time Hector had seen more than one or two structures with two or more walls intact and roofs still overhead. There was also a sound. It was a faint sound, but it was different from the groaning of the near death he had heard thus far. Someone was alive in the area, quietly sobbing. They had to be close for him to hear them so clearly. Hector felt an invisible grip on his heart tighten, even as the organ began to pump harder with anticipation. Hector thought the things he had seen this morning had rendered him entirely numb, but the notion that there was someone here that might be saved, that he wouldn't have to go it alone any further, was enough to restore a little bit of feeling. "Hello!" Hector called out. "I can hear you! Where are you? I'll help you out if I can!" The sound of crying abruptly stopped, as though someone was trying to stifle the sobs. He heard one slip through, but whoever this person was, they were clearly trying to hide themselves. "I'm not here to hurt you," he called again. "I want to help you out. I've been looking for other survivors." Again, there was no response. That was strange. It wasn't like he could fault them, though. Who wouldn't be scared and cautious in times like these? If their experience had been anything like his, one moment they had been going about their business and the next they were standing in a hellscape with no real certainty as to why. Still, Hector was compelled to find them. This was the first time he had felt like another survivor he'd come across actually had a chance. He couldn't just let that go because they were afraid of him. He knew they had to be close. He could still hear their stifled sniveling. From where he stood in the middle of the road, Hector gave the area a once-over. Obviously, the majority of the ruined buildings were out of the question. Anyone inside those would have been dead or screaming in pain like so many others before them. That left only a handful of crumbling houses to investigate. He could make out the general direction of the noise, too, so it couldn't be too hard to find who he was looking for. It was fairly easy to narrow their location down. Keeping an ear out for more crying, Hector headed to the nearest home that looked like he could actually find his way into it. The front section of the house was caved in, so there was no going through the front door. However, around the side a sizable chunk of the wall was missing, providing him a point of ingress. The interior of the house was in surprisingly good condition. Other than the destruction of the front, much of the interior was intact. There didn't seem to be a lot of debris littering the place either. There were shards of glass everywhere, but strangely little destroyed furniture. Hector wondered if the people who lived there simply didn't have much to begin with. It didn't seem to him as though the house was empty and unlived in, but it was extremely sparse. He had found himself in a reasonably well-sized room with recently seared gray carpet. As best Hector could tell, he was standing in what was supposed to be the living room. That was what the ragged old sofa indicated, at least. It was the only furniture in the room to give him an idea of where he was, even though it looked like it had been in pretty bad shape for a long time even before being caught in a disaster. Much of the front corner of the room was blocked off by a pile of rubble. Hector figured there had probably been a small entry hallway and a door to the master bedroom there originally. He had been in a few houses with similar layouts over the years. Walking through a secondary archway at the back of the room, he found himself in a kitchen and dining space. The white-tiled floors were now coated in a layer of dirt and dust. Again, Hector was struck by the lack of furniture. He had made the assumption that the open part of the room was the dining room because of its proximity to the kitchen. There wasn't even a table and chairs present. The kitchen itself was also largely devoid of furnishings or appliances. It was equipped only with a small white fridge and an old-looking oven, whose front glass was blown out and now littered the floor. Hector couldn't help but wonder just how poor the people who had lived in the house were. He wasn't exactly from a rich family, but the idea of someone's home being so empty was alien to him. Was this the sort of conditions that Helena and the brothers had lived in? It was no wonder they joked about him being the rich kid of the group. As his thoughts drifted back to his friends, Hector couldn't help but feel a stab in his chest. He hadn't intended to think about them. He didn't want to think about the people he had lost. He tried to push away the thoughts, but the hope of finding this other survivor had opened a crack in the walls he had put up to protect himself. He couldn't help the tightening in his throat, the surge of his emotions threatening to break through the dam he had erected around them. Hector took a deep breath to steady himself, forcibly shunting memories of those he loved and lost aside so he could focus on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to feel yet. He wasn't ready for that. He just needed to keep moving. With another deep breath, Hector took a step forward and his foot found a clump of glass and pebbles, causing a cracking and crunching sound. In response, from the back of the house, he heard a shocked gasp and more hastily muffled sobbing. It seemed he was in luck. The first house he had tried had been the right one. "It's okay!" Hector called out, trying to convey how non-threatening he was through his tone as best he could. "I promise I'm safe. I'm just looking for other survivors." He continued cautiously through the dining room and into a short hallway with 3 doors across it, 2 on the wall facing him and the remaining one on the short wall at its very end. He moved carefully. He didn't want to seem aggressive. He also didn't want to be ambushed by a person in a panicked craze. The door almost directly across from him was ajar. Inside, Hector could see that part of the wall here had caved in. Water from the exposed plumbing was steadily pouring onto the carpet and a heavily damaged suitcase. He could also see part of the master suite beyond, and a dank smell filled the room. Shards of glass littered the room. Aside from the torn-up, waterlogged suitcase, a lone single bed was the only other object in the room. Clearly, there was nobody hiding in there. Hector moved on to the next room, slowly opening its shut door to reveal a previously white bathroom, now stained gray by the dust and detritus that had blown in when its window had shattered. Nobody was present. That left just one room remaining, the one at the very end of the hall. Its door stood only half open, so Hector couldn't really see inside. He assumed, though, that it would probably be another bedroom. He approached the door and tentatively pushed it open. It creaked slightly in protest, but swung wide without any issue nonetheless. Beyond it, sure enough, was another minor bedroom. It was furnished much the same as the last. That was to say, other than the single bed jammed into the corner, it wasn't. There was a key difference here, though. This room was occupied. A girl was sitting pressed into the corner, her legs pulled up to her chest with her arms wrapped tightly around them. She looked to be about Hector's age, maybe a little younger. It was hard to tell with her compressed into a ball like that. Her face was hidden by her limbs and shoulder-length hair. Her skin was light brown, a darker shade than Hector's own pale tone. One of the sleeves on her purple jacket was singed, and Hector could see burns on her hand. Shards of glass still clung to her, and her body was shaking uncontrollably. She looked pitiable, as though the shaking was from the crushing strain of emotional weight rather than from simple shock or terror. As he stepped into the room, her head moved up and he froze. The glare she was giving him was so intense that for a moment he forgot the state she was in and felt a twinge of fear. So much was communicated in that one look, but Hector couldn't properly translate it. Fear? Anger? Grief? Hate? It was all there and more. Still, she was just a small girl. If she really did go crazy, Hector felt like he could probably fend her off or restrain her until she calmed down. She wasn't some sort of dangerous beast or an enemy. She was just a scared kid like him. He tried his best to put on a reassuring smile and moved further into the room. Get away! She shouted, as though panic-stricken, but the look on her face remained the same. Stay away from me! You have to stay away! That was not the reaction Hector had been expecting, nor hoping for. It triggered a spark of frustration in himself, cracking those protective walls around his emotions even further. He had been looking for other survivors, others who had an actual chance of survival, and now that he'd found one, she was telling him to leave? He refused to believe that this girl actually wanted to be alone in the ruined wasteland that had been her home. Relax, Hector said, trying his best not to let his annoyance show through. I told you, I'm not going to hurt you or anything. He raised his hands, palms out towards her. He had no idea if that sort of thing was ever actually reassuring, but he had seen it done a lot in movies and television, and that was the best he could pull from at that moment. He took a step forward, trying to keep his attempt at a soothing smile plastered on his face. No! She screamed again, sitting up slightly as though getting ready to jump up and run. What? Hector tried to keep it together, but he could feel the facade he was putting on starting to slip. Didn't you hear me? It's okay. I'm safe. Again, Hector started to move forwards. His foot had barely found the ground on his first step when she shouted again. I said go away! She looked frenzied. Keeping her back to the wall, the girl moved into a crouch like an animal preparing to flee. The intensity of that indescribable meld of emotions only growing. Her chest heaved from a mix of effort and the severity of what she was feeling. Her body was still shaking as though under some great burden. Pitiable as she may have seemed to an objective observer, Hector had quickly found himself beyond feeling pity. He had been through the same hell she had, but she was determined to be alone when he just wanted to be with someone who could understand, who could help. Was he just not good enough? Was that it? Was she hoping someone else was going to climb into the rubble looking for her? The spark of frustration that had been steadily growing under Hector's skin ignited, and he lost his temper. Fine, he said. Okay, I'll leave. You stay here alone and miserable and starve to death or whatever you're trying to do. I'm going to go look for someone who's actually worth helping. He turned around, seething with rage, and stormed out of the room. With the need for caution gone and forgotten, it was only a few brief seconds before he was back in the dining area of the demolished house. Behind him, he heard the soft thud of the girl slumping back down against the wall in her renewed sobbing. She made no effort to restrain herself now. There was no point. Hector's gut clenched at the sound, and he found he couldn't take another step forward. A sharp pang of guilt twisted inside him, and his anger quickly melted away. He almost welcomed the feeling. Each negative emotion that hit him was piercing, breaking away the numbness of shock that had so easily encased him as he walked through Kudin. He hadn't even realized it, but he had been wearing that numbness like armor. If you couldn't feel, you couldn't hurt. You couldn't end up like the girl. Then, was she pushing him away and trying to be alone in an attempt to do the same? Was she trying to shut herself away and drive the feelings out? Hector felt he had been right about at least one thing. He couldn't believe that during a calamity like they were experiencing, anyone would truly want to be alone. So he couldn't leave her. This wasn't like all those trapped in fallen homes he had left for dead. He really could be of help here. Turning around, Hector once again made his way to the girl's room. She had returned to the inverted fetal position she had pressed herself into, but her head snapped back up as she heard him approach. She opened her mouth to scream at him again, but Hector quickly cut her off. "Wait," he said from the door. "I'm not going to come any closer than this unless you ask me to. I promise." For a moment she seemed to contemplate yelling at him again. Then her head slumped back down against her knees. Hector figured that was the best he was going to get and took the lack of protest as acquiescence. Holding true to his word, he sat down in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He hadn't realized how tired he was until that moment, but it was now hitting him that he was truly exhausted. At the very least, this moment of quiet company was going to be time he could rest. He had almost forgotten how much his joints ached and that he had a headache that felt like an ice pick was being jammed into his skull. He had been so focused on the task of finding another survivor like himself that everything other than his self-imposed mission had faded away to background noise. Looking back at the girl, Hector was suddenly acutely aware that to others he probably looked much the same. A scared, injured kid with no real sense of what was happening. Just a harrowed boy shambling on, trying to survive. Any pity he felt disappeared, morphing instead into commiseration. They were two of the same, and he hoped they would be able to get through the mess they were in together. Hector couldn't say how long it had been, but he was determined to remain patient. Eventually, though, he noticed that the girl seemed to be shaking a little bit less and her breaths were coming on slower and not as deeply. It seemed to him that it had been long enough, and he hoped those were signs she had calmed down a little. "So," he started, "my name's Hector. What's yours?" An uncomfortable silence hung in the air between them for what felt like an eternity, although surely no time at all had really passed. After a while, she looked up at Hector with a slightly softened expression. "Ellie," she replied. "I'd say nice to meet you," Hector said, "but these aren't the best of circumstances." Ellie exhaled sharply, and a smile tugged at her lips before fading back away. Strangely, the sight made Hector feel a little bit better. Emboldened by that fleeting bit of mirth, he pressed on the conversation. "How old are you?" 12. 13 in December." Her replies were short, but to Hector, at least, they didn't feel reluctant. He took that as a good sign. The fact she was talking to him like that at all was an improvement over their first interaction. "You're only a year younger than me, then." "I just turned 14 last month." She didn't say anything in response, just nodded slightly. Hector supposed there wasn't much more that she could say to that. He was burning with a desire to push his luck further and ask if she knew more about what had happened to them, but he was afraid of wiping out the small progress they had made. He decided to put it off just a bit longer and to keep her talking casually to ease her into it. "What street are we on? Hell, what suburb are we in?" he asked. That was something light and simple, but could also be useful information for navigating the remains of the city. "I don't really know this area." "I don't know." That was an answer that had been wholly unanticipated by Hector. "You don't know? Isn't this your house?" Ellie shook her head. "I'm from a small town near Slowbore. My parents were just renting this place for a few days." Hector felt a wave of sympathy washing over him. Ellie wasn't even from Kudin. Slowbore wasn't that far away. It was the next big city over, but it was still pure misfortune that she was even there at the time when everything went wrong. That explained why the house was so sparse, at least, he supposed. What was he even meant to say to that? Hector was surprised how quickly he was running out of things to ask. He didn't want to ask about her parents or family. He didn't want to talk about Slowbore. Those seemed like landmine topics that would provide no net gain in visiting. But if all he had left were landmines, he might as well trigger the one that would give him information he needed to know. He swallowed hard and let out a sigh, then took the plunge. "Ellie, do you know what happened?" "Yeah." Her voice wavered as she spoke, as though just speaking about the events was magnifying her pain. "The liberation movement set off a nuke in the middle of the city." Hector's mind flashed back to the gradually dissipating cloud he had spied through the haze earlier. There it was. The worst of the theories he had conjured up confirmed in an instant. There was no way to delude himself anymore. He'd been underground when the blast hit and still thrown around like a ball. Chris, Helena, and Eris had been walking open streets when the force of the explosion leveled buildings in the area. There was no way his friends had survived that. His parents would have still been at home, even closer to the blast. They couldn't have made it either. He was alone now. The walls he'd felt being chipped away at were suddenly blown apart like so many had been across Kudin, and Hector suddenly felt himself overwhelmed with emotions. Tears started to form, and in that instant he finally, truly understood what the expression he had first seen on Ellie's face meant. because now he felt it too. He shut his eyes, trying to blot out the world and look away from his reality for just a short while, as though by not looking at it he could forget it. That was impossible, though, no matter what his instinct was. This wasn't something he could hide from. Tears started to stream down Hector's face, and he felt his body heave and convulse in grief as he sniveled and wept. Where was he meant to go from there? The room disappeared. Hector was aware of nothing in that instant except the sheer, crushing force of his own fear and misery. He forgot that he wasn't the only one in the room. It was only when he felt something wrap around him and a body press against his own that he was brought back to Earth. He opened his eyes and through blurry vision saw that Ellie had embraced him and was now crying against him. He reached out and hugged her back, and they wept together. Two strangers united in their suffering and loss. They stayed like that for a long time. At least it felt like a long time to Hector. Yet, even as he was aware of the progress of time, he didn't want to let go. He felt comfort in Ellie's consolation, and it felt good to know that he was probably helping her feel better himself. Soon, though, they had no tears left to cry and found themselves simply holding each other. It was not long after that Ellie finally broke away. She did not return to the corner of the room where she had been before, but sat across from Hector. "Thanks," she said. That confused Hector. She had been the one to decide to comfort him at that moment. Sure, it was a moment shared, but Ellie had been the one to take the initiative. "I didn't really do anything." "You stayed with me, even when I told you to leave," Ellie said. "You were patient with me. You didn't push me away just now, even though I was horrible to you when you got here." "Yeah, well," Hector replied sheepishly. "I don't know about that. I lost my temper and said some pretty messed up things. I only turned back around because I felt guilty." "Still better than a lot of people would have done. Just take the thanks already." To Hector's surprise, a faint smile had returned to her face. Evidently, she found this situation amusing. "Well, if you insist, you're welcome." As they talked, it occurred to Hector that Ellie was squinting at him, as though she was having trouble making out details. Maybe her eyes had been damaged during the blast? If she had been wearing glasses, the shards of glass would have left her eyes a bleeding mess, so he doubted she had naturally poor eyesight. "Are your eyes okay?" he asked. "I didn't notice before because things were so heated, but you're squinting at me." "Oh, right." The smile immediately fell from Ellie's face, as though she had just been reminded of her situation. She didn't retreat back to her corner or shut down, though. She had steeled her resolve. "Nuclear explosions are really bright. I couldn't see anything at all for a little while, but my sight's coming back slowly. No idea if it will ever be perfect again, though." "I guess I was lucky to be more or less underground when it happened. I didn't see the blast, just got a nasty bump on my head." Hector hadn't even thought about the dangers of the explosion beyond the blast and the shockwave. Now that he thought about it, there were probably loads of people walking around blind or deaf. Come to think of it, he was pretty sure he had seen something somewhere about nukes causing electromagnetic pulses that fried electronics. That would explain why his phone stopped working. Hector's train of thought trailed off as he caught note of Ellie's raised eyebrow and the slight smirk now gracing her features. What? What exactly were you doing underground? Shouldn't you have been at school? I was just thinking you don't really have the vibe of a delinquent." To Hector, it was like being splashed with icy water. A chill ran down his spine as he was given a sharp reminder of the events that led to him being where he was when the bomb went off. He half laughed nervously. "Would you believe my classroom was underground?" "If you hadn't made that a question or laughed guiltily like that first, maybe," Ellie replied. "You got me there." Hector laughed for real then, and it felt good. It drowned out the sadness and culpability for a little while. "It's complicated. I'm not some gangster or something, though, obviously." "Well," Ellie said, "whatever complicated situation put you underground instead of in a classroom, that might be the reason you're alive to have this conversation. Maybe you should be thankful for it." Hector hadn't thought of it like that. he was quickly learning that this girl was actually pretty clever. Nothing like him, that was for sure. He wasn't sure he could ever come around to being thankful for the way things had been with his parents. There was too much resentment and too much guilt. He had only just come around to being able to express some of the emotion that had been building up since the explosion. He wasn't ready to start trying to process that yet. It was time to change the subject. "I guess," he said noncommittally. "I do like being alive." "That's the spirit," Ellie said. "On that note, then," Hector continued, "we should go and look for help. There's no point sitting around here. There's bound to be other survivors around. Maybe we can help some people out. Maybe we'll run into someone who knows what we can do about your eyes. Either way, we're more likely to achieve something if we're on the move." Ellie grimaced for a moment, clearly reluctant to leave the place. She nodded, though, relenting to Hector's suggestion. "You're probably right." Hector stood up and offered Ellie his hand. She gripped it, and he felt her faintly tremble. She wasn't going to magically be okay again because he had managed to have a conversation with her. It was a good thing he was there, though. As she stood up, she immediately stumbled forward and would have fallen right back over if he hadn't caught her. He stayed there, holding her up as she regained control of her legs, her breathing suddenly very heavy again. As soon as she was stable, Ellie immediately shoved away from him. She hurriedly stumbled across the room and slumped forward, resting her weight on her arm on the wall. Alarmed, Hector started after her. "Hey, are you okay?" His question was answered with a horrid retching noise as Ellie threw up down the wall, her entire body seeming to heave with the action. "Ellie?" Ellie vomited again, then slowly and shakily straightened herself up and wiped her mouth. She was still panting raggedly, but it wasn't quite as bad. "Sorry, I got knocked about after the bomb went off and it did a number on me. When I got up, I got really dizzy and it made me sick." She smiled weakly at Hector, but he couldn't return the favor. He had seen people getting drunk and throwing up before, but this was much more alarming. She'd gone from seemingly fine to retching so hard it looked like it hurt in an instant. It wasn't like he could do anything about that, though. "Well, at the very least, that's something else to ask about when we find help," Hector said. "Sorry." "It's nothing to be sorry about," Hector shook his head. "You can lean on me a bit while you get your legs back. Let's get out of here, though. It smells like vomit." Ellie chuckled faintly before crossing over the room. She leaned against Hector's side, and he wrapped an arm across her back to hold her up. Ellie placed her arm around Hector for more support. It wasn't easy. She was quite a bit shorter than Hector was, but they managed. "Lead the way," she said,